Orson Ketteridge rode onto Cinder Creek land like he owned it already. He didn't knock, didn't call out, just pushed his horse straight through Bram Voss's front gate. At 7 in the morning, 2 ranch hands flanking him like he was some kind of county official making a lawful visit. Bram was still at the water trough, shirtless in the heat, when Orson pulled up and looked down at him the way a man looks at something stuck to the bottom of his boot. "I heard you took in strays," Orson said. Not a question. His voice carried the flat satisfaction of a man who has already decided how a story ends. "A woman and 5 brats. That right?" Bram didn't answer fast enough. Orson leaned forward in his saddle. "I'll give you 60 cents on the dollar for this place. Right now, today." He let that sit for a second, then added, "Because in 3 months, it won't be worth even that." He wheeled his horse around and left without waiting for a reply. If this story already has you feeling something, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next, because the stories we tell here don't let go easy. Tap like, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started, to a dry ravine, a shattered wagon, and one man who almost rode past. The morning Bramwell Voss found them, he almost didn't stop. That was the truth he'd carry a long time afterward, the ugly, uncomfortable truth that most people would never admit out loud. He almost kept riding. He was already behind on fence work. The sun was already mean and high, even though it wasn't yet 9 o'clock. And the water situation at Cinder Creek had been bad enough the night before that he'd lain awake doing math that didn't add up, no matter how many times he ran it. His well was dropping, had been dropping since May. It was now the 3rd week of July, and the creek that gave the ranch its name had gone from a running stream to a series of muddy pools that even the cattle were starting to avoid. He had problems enough for 3 men. So when he spotted the wagon down in the ravine, the way the canvas was torn and collapsed in on one side, the way one of the rear wheels had sheared clean off and the axle was resting in the dirt, his first instinct was to note it and keep moving. Could have been abandoned days ago. Could have been some family that already found their way to help. Could have been any number of things that weren't his responsibility on a morning when he barely had enough water at home to make coffee. He was 20 yards past when he heard it. Not a scream. Not even a shout. Just a child's voice, low and hoarse, saying something he couldn't make out, and then silence. Bram stopped his horse. He sat there for a moment that felt longer than it was. The cicadas were already going hard in the brush. The sky was white with heat haze. He turned back. The ravine wasn't deep 8, maybe 10 feet, with a gravel bottom and scrub grass along the edges. He had to dismount and lead his horse down the slopes sideways, and as he got closer, he could smell it before he could see it properly. The sour smell of fever sweat and unwashed children, and something else underneath that he recognized from a hard winter 6 years back when his father had been sick for 3 weeks, and the nearest doctor was snowed out. He ducked under the torn canvas. The woman saw him before her eyes could fully focus, and she scrambled upright with a speed that surprised him. She looked ready to fight him with her bare hands if she had to. She had a piece of broken wagon board in her grip, gripped so hard her knuckles were white. Her hair was loose and tangled. Her lips were cracked. Her dress was torn at one shoulder and stained with what looked like dried creek mud. But her eyes were sharp. Whatever else was going wrong with her body, her mind was still working, and it looked at him like a cocked hammer. "Back up," she said. Her voice was almost gone, rough as gravel. "You back up right now, ma'am." Bram lifted both hands, palms out. He kept them there, didn't move. I'm just a rancher." "Cinder Creek Ranch. My name's Bram Voss. I live about 3 miles that direction." He tilted his head. Kept his hands up. "I'm not going to touch anybody." She stared at him. Behind her, he could see children, 1, 2, 3 of them pressed together against the far side of the wagon bed. A 4th one sitting up, watching him with enormous eyes. And one more, the smallest, lying with his head in the older girl's lap, and that one wasn't moving. Bram looked at the small one and felt his stomach drop. "How long has the little boy been like that?" he asked, keeping his voice level. The woman's grip on the board didn't loosen. 4 days, she said, and something in her voice cracked slightly when she said it, not grief exactly, more like someone describing a wound while still standing in the middle of it. "His fever started 4 days ago. I've been keeping him wet. Running out of water. You got any left? A pause. Then quietly, no. Bram turned back to his horse without another word. He had a canteen strapped to his saddle he always rode with too in summer. Old habit from a bad experience, and he unhooked both and carried them back under the canvas. He held one out to her. She took it. Her hand was shaking. She didn't look away from him while she drank. How long have you been in this ravine? He asked. Since yesterday morning. We were here before that too, 2 days upstream when the wheel went. My husband went to find help. She stopped, looked down at the canteen. 4 days ago. Bram said nothing to that. The older boy, 13, maybe, with a serious face and sunburned arms, was watching Bram with the particular intensity of a kid who's been trying to hold everything together and is running on empty. Their eyes met for a second. The boy gave a small, barely visible nod, the kind that means I know exactly how bad this is and I'm glad you're here. I can take you to my ranch, Bram said. He looked at the woman again. It's not much, but there's water and there's shade, and I can ride to town for medicine for your boy. It's 15 miles, but I can make it, she studied him. He could see her running some calculation behind those dark, exhausted eyes, the same kind of math he'd been running since May, the kind where none of the numbers looked good, but you had to pick the best bad option. Why, she said. Not thank you, not yes, just why. Bram almost said something sensible, something about being a decent man, or about his father raising him right. Instead, he said the honest thing, because that boy's going to die if he stays here another day. And I don't want that on my conscience. She looked at him for another long second. Then she set down the board. Elowen Harrow, she said. My name's Elowen Harrow. These are my children. Silas, Nell, Maisie, Tobin, and Finn. She pointed to each one in turn, ending with the small, still shape at her knee. Finn is the one who's sick. Can he be moved? He has to be, she said. Getting 6 people out of a broken wagon in a dry ravine, with 1 horse and no shade and a sick 4-year-old is the kind of thing you don't plan for. You just do it and figure it out as you go. Bram took Finn first, wrapping the boy in the least filthy piece of canvas he could find to keep the sun off him. The child's skin was dry and burning, and he barely stirred when Bram lifted him, which was its own kind of terrible. He handed Finn up to Elowen on the horse's back, then went back for the 2 youngest who could walk a little, Tobin and Maisie, and got them up the slope while the older 2, Silas and Nell, carried the small bag of supplies that constituted everything this family had left. Bram walked. 3 miles in July sun in Colorado territory, walking beside a horse carrying a woman and 2 children, with 2 more walking alongside, and a boy struggling to keep pace. It took the better part of 2 hours. And by the time the ranch came into view, Bram's shirt was soaked through, and his mouth tasted like chalk. Nell, the 10-year-old, had stopped complaining about the heat 20 minutes in and was just quietly moving, her jaw set in a way that made her look like a tiny version of her mother. The ranch was not impressive. He knew it before they arrived, but seeing it through fresh eyes, through the eyes of 6 people who'd just been pulled out of a ravine and were hoping for something better, made him see it the way they did. The house was weathered board, square and practical, nothing extra. The vegetable garden along the south fence was mostly dead. He hadn't been able to water it the way it needed. The chicken coop out back had 4 hens left from the 12 he'd started the year with. The storage building beside the main house had a good roof, but the walls needed attention. He watched Elowen take all of it in as she dismounted, Finn still in her arms. I know it's not. It has shade, she said. And water. That's what matters. She carried Finn straight to the pump without being told where it was, just followed the smell of it, and soaked a cloth and pressed it to the boy's forehead. Maisie came and stood beside her without being asked. Nell started looking in the storage building like she was taking inventory. Silas walked the fence line not playing, not wandering, actually looking at the fence, same as Bram would have. Tobin, the 6-year-old, came and stood beside Bram and looked up at him. Is our house going to be that building? Tobin asked, pointing at the storage structure. I was thinking it could be, yeah, Bram said. If that's. Okay, Tobin said, and went to help his sister. Bram stood in his own yard and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He couldn't have named it right then. He just knew it wasn't the loneliness he'd woken up with that morning. He gave them an hour to settle, got the storage building cleared out and laid bedrolls on the floor and found his extra blankets, which wasn't much, and got the well bucket going, so there was clean water. He found the dried beans in his pantry and what was left of his cornmeal and set a pot on the fire, basic quick as it was, and went out to find Elowen standing at the vegetable garden, not looking defeated by it, but studying it. Specifically studying it. "When did this last get water?" she asked without turning around. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Some of it salvageable. She crouched down and pushed her hand into the soil, near one of the desiccated tomato plants. "The roots on this one are still alive. You'd know that if you worked them." "I haven't had time, she said, not dismissively, just acknowledging it. "You've been doing everything alone." She stood up, pressed the dirt off her hands. "We can work the garden, if you'll let us." Bram opened his mouth and she cut him off before he could start the sentence that was coming, the one about charity, or needing nothing, or being fine. "Don't," she said flatly. "I'm not asking permission to accept handouts. I'm telling you we'll work. Silas can fix fence. I can cook and preserve and sew. Nell keeps house better than most women twice her age. We are not going to sit in that building and eat your food." She met his eyes, and there was something almost fierce in it, like a fire that exhaustion hadn't quite managed to put out. "We pay our way, or we go back to that ravine and figure something else out." "There's nothing to figure out in that ravine," Bram said. "No," she agreed, "there isn't. So we work." That was the whole negotiation. He rode for medicine that same afternoon. Didn't tell her he was going, just saddled back up and rode toward Grey Bend, 15 miles of hard ground, and he made it in under 2 hours because his horse knew the road and because Bram pushed him a little harder than he should have in the heat. The town was small enough that he knew the pharmacist, a wiry man named Coulter, who wore the same tan vest 7 days a week and kept his shelves in better order than any man Bram had met. "Fever medicine," Bram said when he walked in. 4-year-old boy, running dry fever, skin hot to touch, not drinking water even when it's offered. Coulter looked at him over his spectacles. "You got a kid sick?" "Neighbor's child." He paused. "Just what do I need?" Coulter told him, and the price wasn't small. Bram paid it without flinching, which meant he paid it with money he had been thinking of differently, that morning money earmarked for fence wire he actually needed. He bought the medicine and a secondary treatment Coulter recommended and rode home in the early dusk, and when he came back through the gate, he could hear Finn crying inside the storage building, which was actually a relief because it meant the boy was conscious enough to cry. Elowen met him at the door with her hand out, and he put the medicine in it without any ceremony, and she went straight back inside. Taps. Bram unsaddled his horse and rubbed him down and listened to the sounds from the storage building change. Over the next hour, the crying got weaker. Then there was quiet, then a murmuring that he recognized as Elowen's voice, low and steady, the way you talk to someone you're pulling back from a bad place. He ate beans alone at his table and told himself this was temporary. A few days, maybe a week. The child would get better. He'd help them find somewhere to go, some relative somewhere, some town, some kind of plan. He didn't believe it, even while he thought it. The next morning he woke before dawn, which was habit, and went to start the fire for coffee, and found a pot already on the coals, still warm and the coffee already made, and Elowen at the garden in the gray pre-dawn light. Not weeding exactly, but doing something methodical along the tomato rows, careful and precise. Silas was already at the chicken coop, talking to the hens in a low voice that seemed to amuse him and them both. Bram stood at his door with his coffee and watched them work. Nell came out of the storage building with a broom and started on the area in front of the door without being asked, sweeping the dust away from the step with the focused energy of a child who has been taught that clean spaces matter. Maisie appeared behind her and went straight to the pump with a bucket, not playing, not dragging her feet, just doing what needed doing. Tobin was the last one out. He came and found Bram at the door and looked up at him with the same frank consideration he'd had the day before. "Silas says he can fix that section of fence," Tobin said. "The one on the south side that's leaning. He's 13, Bram said. "He fixed fence on the farm we had before," Tobin said. "Before Daddy sold it. He said it without bitterness, just as information. He knows how." Bram looked toward the south fence, the section he'd been meaning to get to for a month. "All right," he said. "I'll show him where the wire is." He didn't think much about what Tobin had said before Daddy sold it, not right then. He had too much else to attend to. but it sat in the back of his mind the way splinters do, small and persistent, working itself deeper as the day went on. Because Elowen had said her husband went for help 4 days ago. And 4 days before that, they'd been traveling. And before that, a farm they used to have. Sold. And a wagon that shattered in a ravine with no man to fix it, no money to replace it, no plan beyond ride ahead and find help. Bram was not a man who made fast judgments, but he was a man who noticed patterns. The man who rode away 4 days ago had not gone for help. He had gone. There was a difference between those two things, and Bram knew it, and he thought maybe Elowen knew it too. But she was not a woman who would let herself fall apart about it when there were 5 children, depending on her to hold things together. So she didn't, and so they didn't talk about it, and the ranch kept moving. Finn improved. By the 3rd day, his fever had broken enough that he could sit up and drink water on his own. And by the 4th day, he was standing at the door of the storage building, watching the chickens with an expression of absolute delight, like he'd never seen a chicken before. Maybe he hadn't, not ones that were actually his. Elowen stood behind him with her hand resting on his small shoulder, and she watched Finn watch the chickens. And something in her face was so complicated relief and grief and exhaustion, and something else that might have been gratitude, or might have been something harder than gratitude, that Bram found a reason to look somewhere else. 3 days after that, Orson Ketteridge appeared for the first time. Bram was at the east fence with Silas when he heard the hoofbeats. He turned and saw Orson coming up the road at a slow, deliberate pace that Bram recognized. It was the pace a man rides when he wants you to see him coming and to think about why. Silas kept working on the fence post, but his hands slowed. "Who's that?" Silas asked. "Orson Ketteridge," Bram said. "Owns Black Spur, east of here. Bigger operation than mine." He watched Orson come. "Don't say anything to him unless he speaks to you first." Silas nodded once, the way he nodded to things that were instructions, not suggestions. Orson pulled up on the other side of the fence. He looked at Silas for a moment, then looked at Bram. "Heard you took in some strays," Orson said. "I heard about that," Bram said. He went back to the fence. "How can I help you, Orson?" "You can help yourself is how you can help me." Orson swung down off his horse uninvited and came along the fence line toward them. He was a big man, gray-haired and solid, built like someone who'd done 30 years of hard work and now paid other people to do it. His boots were better than Bram's. His saddle was significantly better than Bram's. "I know you're behind, Bram. I know your well situation. I know you didn't plant enough this spring because you were dealing with that late snow rot. You don't have a cushion. I'm aware of what I have and don't have," Bram said. "Then you know you can't afford a woman and 5 children eating your winter supply." Silas kept working. His jaw was tight. "They're working the ranch," Bram said. "Not taking charity." Orson looked at Silas with a faint smile that wasn't really a smile. "Son, how old are you?" Silas looked at him steadily. 13. 13. Orson looked back at Bram. "A 13-year-old boy and a woman in a dress are going to work this ranch back into shape." He said it the way you'd say something was the wrong answer. "Bram, I'm trying to give you an exit before this gets embarrassing. 60 cents on the dollar. Today. That's a fair offer given the shape you're in." Bram drove the fence post driver into the ground once, hard. The post didn't budge. "I'm not selling," he said. Orson stayed another 10 minutes and used all of them, running through every variation of the same argument: the water situation, the debt, the coming winter, the way sympathy had a way of becoming a noose. He was smooth about it, never overtly cruel, never quite crossing into something Bram could grab hold of and push back against directly. It was the practiced pressure of a man who'd done this before, who'd waited out enough struggling neighbors to know exactly which words to press on. Bram didn't say much, just kept working. Eventually Orson got back on his horse. "You'll think about it," he said. "I expect I'll think about a lot of things," Bram said. Orson rode away. Silas watched him go. Then quietly, "He wants the land." "Yeah, he's been waiting for you to fail." Bram looked at the boy. 13 years old, thin arms, serious eyes, working a fence post in July heat without complaint. "Where'd you learn to read people like that?" Silas shrugged. "My dad was real good at making everything sound like it was going to work out fine." He picked up the wire and started threading it through the post. "I got good at telling the difference between someone who meant it and someone who didn't." Bram absorbed that. He didn't ask anything else about Elowen's husband that afternoon. But later, when the children were settled and the fire was low, and it was just the two of them at the table with the remains of dinner between them, he looked at Elowen and said it plainly. "He's not coming back, is he?" She looked at her hands. A long moment went by. "No," she said. "He's not." She said it with the finality of someone who'd already finished grieving the thing, or at least started the long work of it. "I've known it longer than 4 days. I just let myself believe the other thing." She looked up. "You already knew." "I had a suspicion." "How?" Bram thought about the best way to say it. "Because a man who goes for help comes back running," he said. "A man who goes, he just goes slow." Elowen looked out the window at the dark. Then she picked up her fork and finished her dinner, and that was all either of them said about it that night, and somehow that felt like the right amount. The weeks that followed were not easy. The vegetable garden came back slowly, grudgingly, the way things that have nearly died do, and Elowen worked it in the early mornings, and the evenings when the heat dropped, and Nell helped. And Maisie helped in her own way, which mostly involved singing to the plants, which Bram privately thought was probably harmless and possibly useful. The chickens improved once Silas started managing the coop with actual attention, cleaning it properly, adjusting their feed, checking the water twice daily. By the end of the 3rd week, they were getting 6 eggs a day instead of 2. Bram and Silas repaired the south fence and 2 sections of the east pasture fence and patched the gap in the storage building wall where wind came through. Silas was not a strong boy, yet he was still growing into his frame, all joints and angles, but he was tireless and precise, and he learned fast. He asked questions, which Bram appreciated. He asked them plainly, without pretending to know things he didn't, which Bram appreciated even more. Tobin turned into Bram's unofficial shadow. It happened without ceremony. The boy just started appearing beside Bram in the mornings and following along on whatever Bram was doing, asking questions about everything. Why does the pump arm need to be primed? What makes a good fence post? Why do you check the horse's feet that way? Bram answered all of it, because there was something about Tobin's particular brand of curiosity that was hard to resist. It came out of genuine interest, not performance. One morning Tobin said, "My daddy never let me do stuff." Bram kept working. "What kind of stuff?" "Fix things." "Help." Tobin watched Bram's hands. He said, "I was too little." "I'm 6. 6 is old enough to help," Bram said. Tobin considered this with great seriousness. "Can I hold the handle thing? The pump handle?" "Yeah." "You can pump it." So Tobin pumped the handle while Bram held the bucket, and Tobin pumped with his whole body, leaning into it, and he spilled water on his boots and looked furious about it and tried again and got it right on the second pass. And the look on his face when the water came clean into the bucket was the kind of look that makes a person remember 6 was not actually that long ago. Finn recovered fully. By the middle of August, the boy was running. He had dark eyes and a tendency to collect things, rocks, feathers, pieces of interesting-looking wood, and he brought them to Bram with great regularity, presenting each one with the solemnity of someone offering a particularly fine gift. Bram accepted all of them. He had a growing collection on the windowsill beside the pump that he did not move and did not think much about except to notice when it got bigger. He noticed the day Finn added a small flat piece of red shale and then stood and looked at it for a while, and then said, without turning around, "I like it here." Bram was behind him at the workbench, mending a harness. He kept working. "Good," he said. "Is that okay?" Finn asked. "Yeah," Bram said. "That's okay." That same week, the first real trouble hit the surrounding settlements. Bram heard about it from Merton Dale, a farmer from the valley 2 miles south, who came by to check on a property boundary question and stayed long enough for coffee and news. There was sickness moving through, not the same kind Finn had weathered, something respiratory, spreading from a trading post to the east. 2 children down in the Holloway family. Rumor of 3 more cases in the settlement near Ketteridge's north grazing land. "Spreading fast," Merton said, holding his coffee cup. "Not sure if it's the same thing killing cattle down near Pueblo or different. Doc Fenwick's already out of his best remedy." Bram was quiet after Merton left. He sat with it for a while before he went and found Elowen at the garden. "There's sickness in the settlements," he said. She kept her hands moving in the soil. "How close?" "South Valley and northeast, moving around us on 2 sides." She was quiet. Then Tobin gets colds hard, he always has. She sat back on her heels. If it comes here, I know. Neither of them said anything useful for a while. Because there wasn't anything useful to say. They were doing everything right already. Keeping the water clean, keeping people fed, keeping the place orderly. You couldn't fence out sickness. You could only stay ahead of it and hope. They didn't get to stay ahead of it. 9 days later, Tobin woke with a cough. By noon, it was in his chest. By evening, he had fever. Bram sat at the edge of the boy's bedroll and pressed the back of his hand to Tobin's forehead and felt the heat coming off him and thought of Finn and about how that had turned out, and tried to remember what Coulter had told him about this kind of fever versus the kind that Finn had. They weren't the same. He knew that, and the medicine he had left was for the kind that Finn had. We need to go to town, Elowen said behind him. Doc Fenwick's out of the best thing, Bram said. Coulter might have something. Coulter might. Bram stood. I'll go. Silas will go with you, Elowen said. Not a request. He's been cooped up, and he's stronger than he was. He can push the pace if the horse slows. Bram looked at Silas in the doorway. The boy's face was controlled and serious. He was looking at his brother, the way Elowen looked at things she'd already decided to fix. All right, Bram said. We ride at first light. They left before first light. The road to Graybend was 15 miles of hard-packed dirt and rock that got rougher in the last 4 miles as it climbed. Bram and Silas rode at a pace just below punishing, not talking much because the pace didn't encourage conversation, and because Silas, for all his willingness to engage on a normal day, understood that this wasn't a normal day and kept his mouth quiet and his attention forward. Graybend was awake when they arrived, more awake than usual, actually, with a small knot of people outside the pharmacist's and a look to the street that Bram recognized as the look of a town in the middle of a problem it hasn't quite figured out yet. The pharmacist's door was open. Bram pushed through. Coulter was behind his counter, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept since Tuesday. Voss, Coulter said. Tobin Harrow, Bram said. 6-year-old. Coughing fever. Chest involved. Coulter shook his head before Bram finished. I'm nearly out. I've had 14 people through here in 2 days, and I ordered more 3 weeks ago and it hasn't come. What do you have? Enough for maybe 3 families. Then I need some of it. Bram, the boy is 6 years old. Coulter looked at him for a long moment, and then at Silas, who was standing in the doorway looking at nothing in particular with the focused stillness of a boy, keeping himself from saying something he'd regret. Coulter looked back at Bram. I'll give you enough for 2 weeks, he said. That'll cost you. I know what it'll cost me. Bram put his money on the counter. They were out the door in 10 minutes. They'd made it back to the edge of town, moving at the same hard pace they'd come in on, when Silas began to sag. Bram noticed it the way you notice something wrong before you can identify it, a change in the sound of the horse beside him, a shift in weight distribution. He looked over and saw Silas slipping sideways in the saddle, not falling, not quite, but his hands had gone loose on the reins and his head was down. Silas. Bram pulled his horse tight against the boy's. Silas, look at me. Silas looked at him. His face was gray-white under the sunburn and his eyes weren't focusing right. I'm okay, he said. And then his eyes rolled back and he went sideways, and Bram caught him with one arm before he hit the ground. They were half a mile from home. Bram's horse was spent. Silas's horse was spent. The sun overhead was its own particular cruelty. Bram held Silas across his saddle, checked his breathing. It was shallow but steady, heat more than fever. The boy had pushed himself too far, on too little, and then made a decision without thinking it through because there wasn't time to think it through. He tied both horses to a scrub pine off the road. He took the medicine from his saddlebag and put it inside his shirt. And then he picked Silas up and carried him. He couldn't have said afterward how long it took. He knew that half a mile is not a long distance, unless you are carrying a 13-year-old boy in July heat after riding 15 miles and sleeping poorly for 3 weeks. In which case, half a mile is something that needs to be negotiated piece by piece, 10 steps at a time, then 10 more after that. His legs went wrong somewhere around the 2/3 mark, not failure. Just a profound heaviness that turned every step into a decision, and he made a sound at some point that he was glad no one was close enough to hear. He kept moving because stopping was not an option he had. When the ranch gate came into view, Elowen saw him from the garden and started running. She reached him at the gate and took part of Silas's weight without a word, getting under the boy's other arm, and together they got him through the gate and into the shade of the porch and down onto the boards. Nell was there immediately with water. Maisie hovered at the edge, quiet for once. Finn watched from the doorway of the storage building with his collection of rocks pressed to his chest. Bram straightened up. His vision went white at the edges. He put his hand on the porch post and held it and breathed, and the world came back, and he reached into his shirt and pulled out the medicine and held it out to Elowen. She took it. She looked at him. "You walked 1/2 mile," he said. The horses were done. She kept looking at him in a way that was hard to read, not surprise. Exactly. More like someone filing something away. "Sit down," she said. "I need to go back for." "Sit down," she said again, and something in the way she said it made it sound like the least negotiable thing anyone had ever said to him. So he sat down on the porch step, and the world tilted slightly and then steadied, and he thought he'd rest for 5 minutes and get up and go get the horses. He didn't get up. The heat had taken more than he knew. His body made a unilateral decision about it, and he went down hard. Not dramatically, he just stopped being able to stay upright. And that was that, and the last thing he heard before the dark came in was Elowen's voice, very close, saying something that wasn't exactly words, more like the sound of someone who'd been through enough bad things that she knew exactly what composure looked like under pressure. He thought, the medicine is in her hands, he thought. That's the part that matters. And then he didn't think anything for a long time. He was out for 2 days. That was the part nobody told him right away. They let him think it had been one night, a bad night, the kind of night where fever takes you under, and you come back up feeling like you've been wrung out and hung to dry. It wasn't until the second morning, when Bram woke up fully and saw that the light was wrong for the time he thought it was, and that Nell was sitting in the chair beside the cot with a piece of mending in her lap like she'd been there a while, that he started doing the math. "What day is it?" he said. His voice came out rougher than expected. Nell looked up from her mending without surprise, like she'd been expecting the question. "Thursday," she said. He'd gone down on Tuesday. He tried to sit up, and the room informed him firmly that it had opinions about that. He lay back down and stared at the ceiling and ran a quick inventory of his body, which was the kind of inventory you do after something hard has happened, checking what still worked, what was sore, what was just tired versus what was actually damaged. Everything seemed to be there. Everything seemed to be functioning. He felt like a horse that had been ridden too hard for too long and was taking stock. "Tobin," he said. "Fever broke yesterday morning," Nell said. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without decoration, giving you the information and letting you do what you wanted with it. "He's in the yard. Mama won't let him do anything yet, but he's out there." Silas, back on his feet. He tried to do fence work yesterday, and Mama told him to sit down, and he sat down. Bram absorbed all of this. The ceiling had a crack running from the south corner toward the center that he'd been meaning to deal with for 2 years. He looked at it and let the information settle. Both boys were all right. The medicine had gotten there in time. He lay there for another few minutes, not because he couldn't move, but because he was letting his body catch up to his mind. And during that time, he became gradually aware of the sounds coming from outside the chickens, which sounded substantially louder than 4 hens had any right to. And below that, the rhythmic sound of something being hammered. And below that, voices. Multiple voices. None of them ones he immediately recognized. "Who's outside?" he asked. Nell glanced toward the window. "Some of the neighbors came," she said. "Mr. Tolliver from the East Valley. The Prentice family. A few others." She went back to her mending. "They brought lumber." Bram turned his head and looked at her. She was 10 years old, and she said they brought lumber the way you'd say they brought potatoes. Just a fact. Just a thing that had happened. "Why?" he said. "Mama organized it," Nell said. She pulled the thread through carefully. "She went out the morning after you went down, and she drove to the Tollivers because she knew they had the wagon, and she came back with Mr. Tolliver, and then she went out again, and she came back with the Prentice men." She paused to examine her stitching. "She said if you were going to need a storage building to live in yourself, somebody needed to make it a proper room." Bram said nothing. He got up 20 minutes later, over Nell's mild objection, moving slowly and holding the wall for the first couple of steps until his body remembered how this worked. He found his boots. He found water and drank it. He found the door and opened it and stood on the porch and looked at his ranch. There were 7 people in his yard. Ephraim Tolliver, who Bram knew from 10 years of neighborly dealings and occasional shared fence maintenance, was directing 2 men Bram recognized as Tolliver's hired hands in laying fresh lumber beside the storage building. The Prentice brothers, both of them, which meant somebody had asked Caleb Prentice specifically, because Caleb didn't come to things he hadn't been asked to, were working on the storage building's south wall with tools from their own wagon. A woman Bram placed after a moment as Marjorie Dale Mertindale's wife was sitting on a crate near the well, talking to Maisie, who was sitting beside her with a look of intense concentration that suggested Marjorie had said something interesting. Elowen was at the center of it, not directing exactly, but moving between the groups with the assurance of someone who knew what needed doing and had communicated that clearly enough that other people also knew. She had her sleeves rolled up. Her hair was pinned differently than usual, more practically. She was carrying a board when she came around the corner of the storage building, said something to Ephraim Tolliver that made him nod immediately, and then saw Bram on the porch. She stopped. They looked at each other across the yard for a moment. Then she walked over, still carrying the board, and stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at him. "You're up," she said. "So I am." He looked at the yard. "You organized this. I asked for help," she said. "There's a difference. Doesn't look like a lot of difference from here." Mr. Tolliver said your father helped him in a bad year. She shifted the board in her grip. He said he'd been looking for a way to return it. I just gave him a reason to come. She looked at him steadily. "You've been working this place alone so long you forgot that people will show up if you let them know you need them." Bram leaned against the door frame. He wasn't sure if he wanted to argue the point or not. He suspected she was right, which was the main reason he wasn't arguing. "How are the horses?" he asked. "Silas went back for them yesterday afternoon." "They're fine." She set the board against the porch railing. "Eat something and then stay out of the way. We've got the work handled. It's my ranch. And in 2 days it's going to have a proper second room and a new wall on the storage building and some timber repair on your south fence line." She tilted her head. "So eat something." He ate something. The day unfolded in a way that required Bram to do something he was constitutionally not designed for, which was accept help while standing still. He managed it by making himself useful on the edges, fetching water, handing tools, holding boards while Ephraim's men nailed them, and by paying close attention to what was being built and how. Because even in an impaired state, his brain kept trying to plan ahead and think about maintenance and what would need doing next. The storage building was getting a proper dividing wall to separate a sleeping space from a work area, and the new timber on the south face was going in with better joint work than the original. Ephraim Tolliver did most of that himself, and he worked like a man who'd spent 40 years putting up buildings and had opinions about the right way to do it that he was happy to demonstrate. He didn't say much while he worked, but every 15 minutes or so, he'd make a comment about the lumber or the joinery or the site placement that wasn't really directed at anyone, just his running conversation with the work itself. At some point, Bram found himself standing beside Ephraim, both of them looking at the new wall going up. "Your father let me use his mule team when mine went lame," Ephraim said without preamble, driving a nail with 2 strokes. Winter of 71. I was behind on everything. He didn't ask for anything back. He drove another nail. Told me I'd find my own way to pass it along someday. Bram looked at the wall. He never told me that. He wouldn't. Ephraim picked up another nail. That's how that kind of thing works. Caleb Prentice came around the corner at that point with a question about the window placement, and Ephraim went with him, and that was the whole conversation, and somehow it was enough. By the end of the day, the new room was framed and half-walled, and the south face of the storage building was solid again. The Prentice brothers left first, with the specific efficiency of men who had other things to get back to, but had prioritized this one. Marjorie Dale left with a jar of Elowen's preserved tomatoes that Elowen pressed on her, which Marjorie accepted with the grace of someone who knew the offer wasn't charity but reciprocity. Ephraim's men went last, loading their wagon, while Ephraim had a final walk around the building to check the work. Ephraim stopped beside Bram on his way to his horse. "Room needs 2 more days to finish right," he said. "I'll send my man Curtis back Thursday. He knows what to do." "Ephraim, you don't need to Thursday," Ephraim said, and got on his horse and left. That night, with Tobin propped up on pillows in the storage building, still not allowed to do anything strenuous, and Finn asleep with his rocks arranged carefully beside him, and the older 3 at the table with the remains of dinner, Bram sat on the porch alone for a while after everyone else went in. The sky was enormous out here. It always was. That was one thing the drought and the debt and the loneliness couldn't touch. The sky was as big as it always had been, full of more stars than any city person ever believed until they saw it. And the air at night had a slight coolness to it, now that it meant summer was already thinking about autumn, even though it was still August. Bram sat with that. He heard the door open behind him and didn't turn around. Elowen settled into the other chair. There were 2 chairs on the porch, had always been 2, which Bram had always thought was an oversight his father made, building a 2-chair porch for a man who lived alone. He'd never moved the second one. They sat for a while without talking. "I need to tell you something," Elowen said. "All right. When you came back carrying Silas," she stopped. "I've seen men do things like that. Not many. My father did something like that once." She was looking at the sky. "I knew what kind of man you were before that. But after that, I knew differently." Bram didn't say anything. "I'm not saying that to flatter you," she added. "I'm saying it because it's relevant to what I'm going to say next." "Which is?" She turned and looked at him directly, which was something Elowen Harrow did when she meant business, and didn't want there to be any ambiguity about it. "I've been thinking about the problem," she said. "Your problem. Our problem now, I suppose, because we made it our problem when you took us in, and we don't intend to leave you worse off than you were. You don't owe me—" "I'm not talking about owing," she said, with a patience that had a slight edge to it. "I'm talking about practicality. You're running one man's worth of operation on land that could support more. You've been trying to keep a ranch alive by shrinking it down to what one person can manage, and the drought made that worse, and the debt made that worse, and by the time we showed up, you were down to your last viable season." Bram looked at the stars. "You don't have to be quite so direct about it." "I'm always direct about it." She didn't apologize for that. "Here's what I've been thinking. We've already improved the garden and the chickens. We know that's working. What I can also do what I'm good at is sewing. Not mending and patching, which I can do in my sleep. Real work. Custom dresses, alterations, work shirts, good quality. The women in Graybend and the ranch families, they need it, and they either pay to have things made or they go without, because there's no one here who does that work at a price they can actually meet." Bram turned his head. "I've already talked to Marjorie Dale," Elowen said. "She wants 2 work dresses and a good visiting dress. She told me 2 other women who've been wanting the same." She paused. "I can do that work in the evenings and during the children's rest hours. It doesn't take anything from the ranch's operation. It adds income." "You're talking about running a business," Bram said. "I'm talking about running several small ones at the same time, so that no single bad month can knock the whole thing over." She looked out at the dark. "The garden isn't just for us. If we expand it right, we can sell preserved goods. The chickens are already producing more than we need that's eggs for sale. Silas is nearly 14. Ranch families in the valley hire seasonal help at harvest and roundup. He could earn wages." Bram was quiet for a moment. "He's your son, who is nearly 14 and going to need to learn what real work in the world pays," she said plainly. "He can't spend his life in a garden. He needs to learn the larger operation. Working neighboring ranches teaches him things we can't teach him here." Bram thought about Silas on the fence line. Silas carrying fence wire without complaint. Silas on the horse beside him, pushing toward town, running on determination and not much else. "He's a good worker," Bram said. "I know he is," Elowen said, with the quiet confidence of a mother who knows her child. "The question is whether you'll let us try all of this." Bram looked at her. "You're asking my permission?" "I'm asking your agreement," she said. "There's a difference. This is your ranch. I won't put things in motion that affect it without you knowing what I intend. But I'll tell you plainly, I think we can pull this place out of where it is before winter closes in. I think we can do it without borrowing money and without selling to Ketteridge. At the name Ketteridge, something shifted in Bram's expression. "He'll come back," Bram said. "I expect he will. He doesn't make offers more than twice. After that, he just waits." Elowen was quiet for a moment. "Then we make sure he waits forever," she said. "By the time he figures out this place isn't failing, it won't matter what he wants." They sat with that for a moment. An owl called from somewhere in the scrub east of the fence line 3 times, then went quiet. "All right," Bram said. "All right, we try it? All right, we try it." She stood up. "Good." She put her hand briefly on the porch railing, a small decisive gesture, and went inside. Bram sat alone again. He looked at the 2 chairs and then at the sky, and he stayed out there a little longer than he needed to. The next 3 weeks were a different kind of hard. Not the hard of crisis or fear, the hard of too much to do and not enough hours, which is its own specific kind of grueling. Bram and Silas expanded the garden at the south end by breaking new ground, which in late summer Colorado soil that hadn't been turned properly in years meant coming up against roots and rock and clay that fought back. They went at it with a pickaxe and a borrowed plow attachment and patience, or at least Bram went at it with patience, and Silas went at it with a stubbornness that produced the same results. Nell took over the household records. This happened naturally, the way things in a functioning group tend to happen. She started keeping track of what was in the pantry and the storage, and one morning she appeared at Bram's workbench with a piece of paper and a list. "We've got enough cornmeal for 3 weeks, she said. "Less if Tobin keeps eating the way he does." Bram looked at the list. It was organized by category and written in a hand that was neater than his own. "How old are you again?" 10, she said. She pointed at the bottom of the list. "We need more salt and lamp oil. I'll add it to the town run." "I already added it," she said, and pointed to where she'd written it. Bram looked at Nell and thought about the kind of people certain kinds of hard childhoods produced, not damaged people, or not always, but sometimes instead, people who had been forced to be competent earlier than most and had discovered that competence suited them. He thought Nell was one of those. Maisie was different. Maisie was 8 and moved through the world on a different frequency than her sister, more improvisational, more likely to sing to herself or rearrange things according to an aesthetic logic only she fully understood. The garden she tended, the small patch Elowen had given her responsibility for, was the most elaborately organized section, with little stone markers at each plant and a careful rearrangement of the chicken fence nearby that actually, inexplicably, improved the chickens' access to shade. Bram had noticed that and hadn't said anything, just noted it. Tobin, cleared for light work 2 weeks after his fever broke, became a genuine small engine of usefulness, fetching, carrying, holding things, getting underfoot in ways that were somehow more helpful than not. He had a gift for showing up exactly when an extra pair of hands was needed, which Bram suspected was partly intuition and partly the result of watching everything very carefully. The sewing orders came in. Elowen had set up in the corner of the main house. Bram had given her a table near the east window for the light, and she worked in the evenings after dinner with a concentration that excluded everything that wasn't the cloth in front of her. The first dress she finished was for Marjorie Dale, and when Marjorie came to collect it and held it up and turned it in the light, she looked at Elowen with an expression Bram happened to catch from the doorway. The particular expression of someone who has received better than they expected. "You do this again next season," Marjorie said, "and I'll send every woman I know to you." "Send them now," Elowen said. "I've got time in the evenings." Marjorie came back 4 days later with her sister-in-law and a woman from the settlement near Ketteridge's North Land who introduced herself as Vera and had very particular opinions about sleeve lengths. Elowen handled all 3 of them at once, measuring and noting and making small adjustments to her plans without apparent strain, and Bram, watching from across the yard, found himself thinking that Elowen Harrow in her element was a different creature than Elowen Harrow surviving. Both were formidable. One of them was something else as well. The money started coming in small amounts, not transformative, but real. Eggs, preserved tomatoes that Elowen had put up with Maisie's help in a batch that filled 12 jars. 2 dresses paid for, 2 more in progress. Silas had put in 4 days of fence work at the Prentice spread and come home with wages and a quiet pride that he managed not to make into a performance. Bram added it all up one evening on the back of an envelope, the way his father had always done accounts, and sat with the number. It wasn't enough to call the ranch saved, but it was enough to call it different than it had been. That was when Orson Ketteridge came back. He came on a Wednesday afternoon, earlier than Bram expected, and he came alone this time, which was different. No ranch hands flanking him, just Orson on his gray horse, riding up to the gate at the same slow, deliberate pace as before, and waiting there until Bram came to meet him. Bram came to the gate. He didn't open it. They looked at each other over the top rail. "You look better than I expected," Orson said. "I had some help." "I heard." Orson looked past Bram at the yard, at the improved storage building, at the expanded garden, at Silas hauling a bucket of water across the yard in the background. Something moved in Orson's expression that was harder to read than his usual certainty. "I heard the Tollivers came out. The Prentice boys." "They did." "That's not nothing," Orson said, and he said it in a way that surprised Bram, less like a man recalibrating his strategy and more like a man genuinely registering something. "Ephraim Tolliver doesn't haul lumber for people he doesn't respect." Bram leaned on the gatepost. "What can I do for you, Orson?" Orson looked at him. "My offer stands, 60 cents. I know, the drought isn't over. You know that. I know that, too. And a woman with 5 children is still 5 more mouths than this land can." "She's brought in income," Bram said already. "Sewing orders, eggs, preserved goods." Silas worked 4 days at Prentice and earned wages. The garden's got more in it than it's had in 3 years. He said it without heat, just laying the information down. They're not mouths on a broken operation. They're people working a different operation than the one you think you're looking at. Orson was quiet. "I'm not selling," Bram said. Orson turned his horse. He stopped after 2 paces and looked back over his shoulder, and there was something in his face that Bram couldn't read and didn't try to. "The woman," Orson said. "What's her situation?" "Legally." Bram met his eyes. "She's a member of this household." "That's not a legal situation," Orson said. "I'm working on it," Bram said. It wasn't something he'd said out loud before. He wasn't entirely sure where it came from, except that it was true he had been thinking about it, turning it over in a back corner of his mind since the conversation on the porch, since Ephraim Tolliver talking about his father, since the moment Finn had arranged his rocks on the windowsill and announced he liked it here. Orson looked at him for another moment. Then he rode away. Bram stood at the gate until Orson was out of sight. Then he went and found Silas at the water trough and said, "I need to go to Graybend tomorrow. Come with me if you want." Silas looked up. "Something wrong?" "No," Bram said. "Something I need to do." They went to Graybend the next morning, just the 2 of them, leaving before the household was fully awake. The road felt different without urgency, pushing them. They took it at a reasonable pace, and Silas, freed from the silence of emergency, talked. He talked about the Prentice Ranch and what he'd noticed about their cattle rotation. He talked about the fence technique Caleb Prentice's hand had shown him, different from what Bram had taught him, not better or worse, but different. He asked questions about the creek situation, the water rights, how those worked out here versus what he'd known back east. Bram answered all of it, and at some point realized he was doing what his father had done on ranch trips when Bram was young, talking through problems out loud, not because the other person had all the answers, but because putting things into words helped you hear them clearly. In Graybend, Bram stopped at the land registry office. He was in there for 40 minutes. Silas waited outside with the horses and didn't ask questions when Bram came out, just noted the expression on Bram's face, which was the look of someone who has done something they'd been deciding to do for a while, and found it was simpler than expected. They made 3 more stops: salt, lamp oil, a spool of thread Elowen had specifically requested, a small bag of hard candy that Bram bought without giving a stated reason, and put in his saddlebag without comment. On the way back, Silas said, "What did you do at the registry office?" Bram thought about it. "Set some things right," he said. Silas nodded, the way he nodded to things that were answers even if they weren't complete ones. They rode the rest of the way back, mostly in comfortable quiet, the kind that comes when 2 people have spent enough time working alongside each other that silence doesn't need filling. When they got back, Finn was at the gate. He was there because he'd apparently decided the gate area was his domain for the afternoon, and he'd arranged a collection of medium-sized rocks along the gate post in a pattern that made sense to him and was being guarded against disturbance. He looked up when they rode in. I saved you something, Finn said to Bram. What'd you save me? Finn produced, from his pocket, a chicken feather. A particularly fine one, Bram noted mostly white with a pale gray stripe. Finn held it out. Bram took it seriously. That's a good one, he said. I know, Finn said, satisfied, and went back to his rocks. Bram put the feather in his pocket and unsaddled his horse and thought about a 4-year-old boy who collected things and gave them away to people he decided were worth giving to. He put the candy in the kitchen without explanation, and by evening it had been discovered and distributed with great fairness by Nell, who portioned it into equal shares and counted twice to make sure. 2 days later, he sat down with Elowen at the table after the children were asleep. He put a piece of paper in front of her. She looked at it. She was quiet for a long time. This says partnership, she said. Yeah, equal share in the operation, equal share in all of it. Work, decisions, income, property. He'd thought about how to say the next part. And if something happens to me, sickness, accident, anything, it goes to you and the children. All of it. The ranch, the water rights, the house, everything. Not back to the county, not to Ketteridge by default. To you. Elowen set the paper down. She pressed her hands flat on the table on either side of it, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of steadying herself when something hit her harder than she'd prepared for. You don't know me well enough to do this, she said. Her voice was controlled, but just barely. I know you well enough, he said. I've watched you manage 6 people in a crisis with no resources and no sleep. I've watched your children, which tells me most of what I need to know about what kind of person you are. And I've watched you turn down easy options twice now, when the easier thing would have been to let someone else carry the weight. She looked at the paper. This is permanent. That's why I did it at the registry office, he said. It's registered, legal, a long silence. Bram, she said, and something in the way she said his name, not sharp or careful or deliberate, just his name. The way you say a name when you're talking to a person you've actually started to know made him meet her eyes. Yeah, he said. What do you get out of this? He thought about it honestly. I get someone to build this with, he said, instead of just someone to build it for. Elowen looked at the paper for another moment. Then she picked it up and held it more carefully, the way you hold a thing you've decided to keep. Okay, she said. Outside, the wind came up from the south, the way it did before autumn started making itself felt. And the storage building creaked slightly in a way that it hadn't before Ephraim Tolliver's man Curtis had come and finished the repair work on Thursday as promised. A small creak, familiar and solid, the sound of a building settling into itself. Bram banked the fire. Elowen folded the paper carefully and held on to it. Neither of them said much after that, but neither of them moved to leave the table for a while either, and the fire put out enough warmth to make the room feel like what it had never quite been before, and what both of them, in their different kinds of exhaustion and their different kinds of hope, had been working toward without saying so directly. Something that felt like it might last. The partnership paper sat on the shelf above the fireplace after that night, held in place by the piece of red shale Finn had given Bram 3 weeks earlier. Nobody commented on that arrangement. It just happened, the way things in a functioning household happen when people are paying attention to what matters and not making speeches about it. September came in hard. Not cold, yet cold was still a ways off, but the quality of the heat changed, the way it does in Colorado when the season starts thinking about shifting. The mornings had an edge to them that the July mornings hadn't, and the light in the late afternoon went gold in a way that felt like a warning as much as anything beautiful. Bram noticed it the way ranchers notice things, practically, with an eye toward what it meant for the work schedule. It meant winter preparation had to start now. He sat down one morning with his envelope accounting system and laid out what they had. The numbers were better than they'd been in July. Not good, not the kind of good where a man sleeps easy, but better. The garden had produced more than he'd thought it would when Elowen first started working it back from the edge of dead, and the preservation work she and the girls had done through August had put up more jars than Bram had seen in that cellar since his mother's time. 41 jars. He'd counted them twice because the first count surprised him. Tomatoes, beans, corn relish, apple preserves from the 3 trees at the property's edge that he'd mostly ignored for years. The egg income was modest but consistent. The sewing work was consistent and not modest. Elowen had filled 6 orders in August and had 3 more waiting, and word had spread far enough that a woman from the settlement near the Ketteridge, North grazing land, had ridden 40 minutes each way to bring fabric and measurements. Silas had worked 12 days total at neighboring ranches and brought back wages that he handed to Elowen without being asked, every time. And every time she took a portion and put the rest in the jar on the kitchen shelf that had become the household's operating fund. Silas never complained about any of it. He did sometimes complain about other things, the specific difficulty of certain fence terrain. A particular horse at the Prentice spread that he described as having a personal grievance against him, but not about the work or the wages. The debt picture was still the hard part. Bram owed money on the land a loan taken in his father's last year, extended twice, currently sitting at an interest rate that was not criminal but was not friendly either. He'd been servicing it barely. The new income streams changed the calculation, but only just. They needed one more good season, or one significant additional income source, or both. He was thinking about that on a Tuesday morning when Merton Dale came by again. Merton had a habit of appearing at the ranch when he had information. It was because he was a gossip, less because he was a gossip, and more because he genuinely believed in the value of people knowing things that affected them. He came on horseback, declined coffee, and stood at the fence with the look of a man delivering news he's already organized into points. "Ketteridge is moving on the Fairburn water claim," Merton said. Bram went still. "The Fairburn claim is settled. Was settled. Old Clement Fairburn died in August, and his son Wesley doesn't know the territory. And Ketteridge's man went to the county office last week with a counterfiling on the creek access." Merton adjusted his hat. "If Ketteridge gets that claim reclassified, he controls the upper creek. Your water access comes through there." Bram did the math in about 4 seconds and didn't like any of it. The creek that gave Cinder Creek Ranch its name ran from northeast to southwest across the property's upper corner. If Ketteridge controlled the upstream claim, he could legally restrict flow, not eliminate it. Water rights law in the territory was specific about downstream access, but restrict it to whatever the legal minimum was, which in a drought year was not enough for cattle and a working ranch. "When was the counterfiling made?" Bram asked. "Last Wednesday." "How long to contest it?" 30 days from filing." Merton looked at him. "You've got 23 days. Merton left. Bram stood at the fence for a while, doing the kind of thinking that doesn't look like thinking from the outside, just a man standing still, jaw tight, eyes on the middle distance. He went inside and found Elowen. She was at her sewing table, pinning a sleeve to a bodice, and she looked up when he came in and read his face immediately, the way she'd gotten very good at doing. "What happened?" she said. "Not a question," he told her. She set down the sleeve and the pins very deliberately. She was quiet for a moment. "Show me the water access on the property." He found the land plat he kept in the desk drawer, unfolded it on the table. She leaned over it, and he pointed out the creek line, the property boundaries, the Fairburn claim upstream. "If he gets this reclassified," Bram said, tracing the line, "and we have a dry year." "The ranch fails," she said flatly, "eventually. Not immediately, but eventually. He knows that." She studied the plat. "This Wesley Fairburn. Does he know what he signed? Probably not. He's from Ohio, from what I know. His father never brought him out. Then he doesn't know what he's giving away." Elowen straightened up. "Someone needs to talk to him, before Ketteridge's man gets to him again." "I was thinking the same thing. Do you know where he's staying?" "He'd have gone to Graybend. Only hotel in 40 miles. Elowen looked at Bram. "Go today. Don't wait. That was my plan." "I know," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew I thought it was right." He left within the hour. Graybend's hotel was a 2-story frame building on the main street, run by a woman named Cora Hitch, who kept it cleaner than its exterior suggested and had a memory for guests that made the town register almost redundant. She told Bram that Wesley Fairburn was in room 4, had been there 8 days, and had the slightly lost look of a man who'd inherited something he didn't fully understand. She was not wrong. Wesley Fairburn was 28, soft-handed in a way that spoke to office work rather than outdoor labor. And he had his father's papers spread across the small room's table in a disorganized way that suggested he'd been trying to make sense of them and hadn't gotten far. He let Bram in after a moment of visible hesitation, and Bram took the chair by the window and didn't waste time on preamble. "I'm Bram Voss," he said. "I own Cinder Creek Ranch downstream from your father's claim. We need to talk about what you signed last Wednesday." Wesley looked uncomfortable. Mr. Ketteridge's representative explained it as a standard. Orson Ketteridge's representative explained it in a way that benefits Orson Ketteridge, Bram said. Not unkindly, just clearly. "I'm going to explain it in a way that tells you what you actually own and what you gave away." Wesley was quiet. Bram spent the next 40 minutes going through it. He used the copy of the water rights filing he'd stopped to get from the county office on his way through, and he was as direct and as factual as he could manage. Because Wesley Fairburn was not a stupid man, he was an uninformed one, which is a very different problem, and one that can be fixed. By the end of it, Wesley was sitting differently in his chair. "He told me it was a standard upstream easement," Wesley said. He sounded less lost and more angry, which Bram took as progress. "It's a reclassification that gives him control of flow management," Bram said, "which in a drought year puts you out of viable water." Wesley rubbed his face with both hands. "My father would have known that. Your father knew this land the way I know it. He never would have signed that." A long pause. "What do I do?" Wesley said. "Go to the county office and withdraw the counterfiling," Bram said. "You have the right to do that inside 30 days. I've got 23 days left. Your name is on the filing, your signature withdraws it." He paused. "After that, if you want to sell the upstream claim outright, I'd be interested in a fair conversation about price. If you want to hold it yourself and manage it through an agent, I can suggest someone trustworthy. But the first step is withdrawing the filing." Wesley looked at the papers on his table. "And if Ketteridge comes back?" "He probably will," Bram said honestly. "But a withdrawn filing is a withdrawn filing. He'd have to start the legal process over, and you'd know what to look for this time." Wesley nodded slowly. He looked like a man who just understood that the thing he'd been handed was more complicated than he'd thought, but who'd also just been given a clearer map of it than he'd had before. "All right," Wesley said. "Tomorrow morning. I'll be at the county office at 9, Bram said, "in case you need anything clarified." He rode home in the early evening with the particular feeling of a man who's managed to stop a bad thing from happening.
Not relief exactly, more like the absence of weight he hadn't quite realized how fully
He'd picked up. The road back was longer in the dark, but his horse knew it, and he let the horse set the pace and thought about water rights and winter and the partnership paper on the shelf above the fire. When he came through the gate, Silas was waiting. Not dramatically, Silas didn't do dramatic, but he was sitting on the porch step, which meant he'd been watching for Bram's return. He stood when Bram rode up. "How'd it go?" Silas said. Bram dismounted. "He'll withdraw it tomorrow." Silas exhaled. A short, controlled exhale, but genuine. Mama was right then. "Your mother's usually right about which problem needs addressing first," Bram said. "She'll say she just asked the obvious question," Silas said. "And she'll be right about that too." Bram handed Silas the reins. "I can take him. I've got him," Silas said, and led the horse to the trough with the ease of someone who'd been doing it long enough that it wasn't a task anymore, just a thing that got done. Wesley Fairburn withdrew the counterfiling at 9:15 the next morning. Bram was there. He watched it happen and said thank you and meant it. And on his way out of the county office, he passed Orson Ketteridge's land agent coming in the other direction on the boardwalk, a man named Dillard who wore his hat at an angle that suggested he thought well of himself. Dillard stopped when he saw Bram. He looked like a man who'd just understood he'd gotten somewhere too late. Bram nodded pleasantly and kept walking. He allowed himself one moment of satisfaction about that, which lasted approximately until he got back to his horse and started thinking about the next problem, which was always the way of it. The next problem arrived 4 days later in the form of a letter. Not to Bram. To Elowen. It was delivered to the ranch by a rider from Graybend who said he'd been asked to bring it out specifically, and he handed it to Elowen and waited, and Elowen thanked him and waited until he left to open it. Standing at the kitchen table, with the careful stillness she used when she was managing something difficult. Bram was at the workbench and saw her face while she read it. He came inside. "What is it?" She set it on the table. He picked it up. It was from a lawyer in Graybend. It informed Elowen that her husband, Thomas Harrow, had filed a legal notice of abandonment and was seeking dissolution of the marriage and a legal declaration that any property or assets held in her name were subject to prior claim by outstanding debts in his name specifically. Debts owed to a trading concern in Kansas that he had apparently been running from for some time. Bram read it twice. His hands were very still while he read. "Thomas has debts," Elowen said. Her voice was flat and precise, the way it got when she was keeping a lid on something. "I knew there were debts. I didn't know how bad. This says prior claim on assets in your name," Bram said. "The partnership is registered in your name. I know what it says." He looked at her. "Did you know he'd do this?" "I knew he was gone." She sat down at the table. "I didn't know he'd come back sideways through a lawyer." She pressed her hands flat on the table again, that steadying gesture. "He's trying to claim anything I have before I can build enough, that he can't touch it." "The partnership registration is less than a month old," Bram said. "If a debt claim predates it, Elowen." "I know, Bram." She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that wasn't fear and wasn't anger exactly. It was the look of someone who's been running hard and just found out the finish line moved. "I need to think." He put the letter back on the table and went outside and stood in the yard for a moment doing the same kind of thinking he'd done when Merton told him about the water claim. The kind that doesn't produce answers fast, but has to happen anyway before the answers can come. Then he went back inside. "I need to go back to Graybend," he said. "To the land registry and to a lawyer. Not the one who sent that letter." "There's only one lawyer in Graybend," Elowen said. "Then I need to find out which client he's representing and whether he can represent both." He paused. "The water rights filing took 23 days to sort out, and we had 3 weeks to do it. This gives us how long?" Elowen looked at the letter. 30 days to respond. "Then we have 30 days. He picked up his hat. "Get me the partnership paper. I want to take it with me." She got the paper from the shelf. She handed it to him and then held on to it for a second longer than necessary before she let go, not because she was reluctant, but because she was making sure he understood it mattered. He understood. The lawyer in Graybend was a man named Aldous Pierce, who operated out of a room above the dry goods store and had the look of someone who had been a lawyer in a small territory town long enough to have seen most of the ways people could make legal problems for each other. He read the letter, read the partnership registration, and asked Bram 3 questions in a precise, unhurried way. Then he said the debt claim is in Kansas. This is Colorado territory. Cross-territory debt claims on newly registered property face a higher threshold here, particularly if the property was legally transferred before the claim was formalized. "The registration was 4 weeks ago," Bram said. "And the Kansas claim, when was it filed?" "The letter doesn't say. I'll find out." Pierce made a note. "The dissolution filing is real, and that will proceed regardless. But the property claim is a separate matter, and it has to go through territorial courts here, not Kansas procedure." He looked at Bram over his glasses. "What's the woman's situation? Is she represented?" "She is now," Bram said. "By me, if that's how this works." Pierce looked at him for a moment. "You'd be better served having her here in person." "Can we come Thursday?" "Thursday at 10. Bram thanked him, paid the initial consultation fee for money he'd planned to spend on fence wire. The fence wire was always the thing that gave and rode back to the ranch. He told Elowen that evening, after dinner, when the children were doing the things children do in the hour before sleep, Nell reading, Maisie drawing something on the back of a flour sack, Tobin building an elaborate structure from sticks that kept falling over in ways that offended him personally, Finn asleep already, because 4-year-olds have the ability to go from fully operational to completely unconscious with no intermediate steps. Silas was on the porch. Bram told Elowen what Pierce had said. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her qualities. She let you finish before she responded, which meant she'd actually thought about it instead of just waiting for a gap to talk. "He thinks the property claim can be challenged," she said. "He thinks the threshold's higher here and the Kansas filing is complicated by territory law." Bram paused. "He didn't say it was easy. He said it was possible." "What does it cost to make it possible?" "I don't know yet. Thursday will give us a better idea." She looked at her hands. "If it's more than we have. Then we figure that out, Thursday." He said it plainly, not to cut off the concern, but because going over bad scenarios they hadn't reached yet, was a kind of energy expenditure they couldn't afford. One thing at a time. She nodded slowly. Elowen, he said. She looked at him. Whatever Thomas owes, that's his debt. Not yours. He said it because he thought she needed to hear it said directly, not wrapped in anything, just stated. You didn't run up those debts. You didn't sell a farm and take your family on the road to nowhere and ride away when things got hard. That was him. The law may not always see it that way, but that's the fact. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved, not breaking, not even close, but shifting slightly, the way something shifts when it's been held too rigid, and finally gets permission to ease a little. I know, she said quietly. I know it was him. She picked up her sewing. I just need to make sure the law knows it too. Thursday came. Aldous Pierce met with both of them and went through the situation methodically, asking Elowen questions about the dates when they'd left Kansas, when Thomas had last contributed financially to the family, when he'd left, and writing down her answers in a small leather notebook with a pen he refilled twice during the meeting. At the end of it, he said, the dissolution will proceed. I can't stop that, and frankly, there's no reason to try. He looked at Elowen. The property claim is a different matter. The Kansas debt was running before you registered the partnership here. But the key question is whether those debts were in your name jointly or in his name alone. His name, Elowen said. He always handled the finances. I never signed anything. You're certain? I'm certain because I wasn't allowed to. She said it without bitterness, just fact. He handled everything. I managed the household. He made the financial decisions, and he didn't discuss them. Pierce made a note. Then your exposure is limited. His debts are his, and a claim against your registered property would need to demonstrate your direct liability, which without your signature on the original debt instruments is a difficult case to make. He set down his pen. It's not impossible, but it's difficult, and the Kansas concern would need to pursue it through territorial courts here, which takes time and money on their side. He looked at both of them. My recommendation is a formal response to the letter stating your position, a request for documentation of the original debt instruments, and a counterfiling protecting the registered partnership against speculative claims. Cost, Bram said, Pierce told him. It was not small. It was, in fact, very close to the total of what sat in the jar on the kitchen shelf, plus what Bram had in his desk drawer. He did the math in his head while Pierce watched him do it. Do it, Bram said. Elowen turned to look at him. We don't have a ranch if the water claim had gone through, he said. We don't have a ranch if this claim goes through. Everything else we're building is built on those two things staying solid. He looked at Pierce. Do it. Pierce started drafting the response that afternoon. They rode back to the ranch, in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who've just committed to something large and are sitting with the weight of it. About halfway home, Elowen said, that was the rest of the operating fund. Yeah, we'll need to rebuild it. We will. Nell's got 3 more sewing orders in the queue. And the Dale family wants preserved goods for winter supply, they asked last week. Bram looked at her. You're already working the math. I'm always working the math. She wasn't self-deprecating about it, just honest. That's how we stay ahead of it. He thought about that. About a woman who had been kept away from financial decisions her entire marriage, who handled money the way other people handle necessary tools carefully, without drama, with complete understanding of what each dollar was actually doing. They got back to find Silas had fixed the lean in the east fence section without being asked. Had done it correctly. He'd learned from watching Bram that the right way to set a post in that soil required going 6 inches deeper than you thought you needed to. And he'd done it, and was now helping Tobin with the stick structure that had been causing so much grief, which was apparently intended to be some kind of animal enclosure for imaginary livestock. Maisie had reorganized the chicken coop. Not just cleaned it, reorganized it, in a way that Bram spent 5 minutes looking at before he understood that she'd improved the roosting arrangement in a way that would make the morning collection easier. She was 8. He asked her how she'd thought to do it. The chickens were bumping into each other, she said, as if this were self-evident. So I moved things. Nell was at the kitchen table with a letter she'd written in response to a sewing inquiry from a woman in the next settlement, written in her careful hand, asking the right questions about measurements and fabric preferences. Professional in a way that would have been impressive from a woman twice her age. I checked your queue, Nell said to Elowen when they came in. You've got capacity for 2 more orders before the end of October if you don't take anything complex. Elowen looked at her daughter. Did you account for the Dale Preserves order? Nell pointed to a note at the bottom of her list. Elowen looked at Bram. Bram looked at Nell. Good, Elowen said. That night Bram sat on the porch alone again, late after everyone else was in. The stars were doing what they always did, which was exist on a scale that made most human problems feel about the right size serious, but not insurmountable. The air was distinctly cooler now. Autumn was not approaching anymore. It was arriving. He thought about Thomas Harrow, who had ridden away from a broken wagon and not come back. He couldn't manage much anger about it anymore. He'd spent some anger on the man in the early weeks, and it had burned out for lack of fuel. Because you can only sustain anger at a person who isn't there for so long before it starts feeling like a waste of something. What he thought about more was what Thomas Harrow had left behind. 5 children who were, all of them, more than their father, had apparently been willing to see. A woman who'd been kept from her own finances and had turned out to be better at them than the man who'd kept her from them. He thought about the partnership paper on the shelf. He thought about the lawyer's fee that had emptied the operating fund, and about the 3 sewing orders in Elowen's queue, and about Nell's note at the bottom of the list. Then he heard the door open behind him. Not Elowen this time. Silas. The boy he was close enough to a young man that the word boy was getting less accurate by the week, came and sat on the step, not in the chair, and looked out at the same dark that Bram was looking at. Is it bad? Silas asked. The legal thing. It's manageable, Bram said. It'll cost us some time and money, but it's manageable. Silas was quiet for a moment. I want to do more of the seasonal work, he said. If there's anything in the valley that'll take me through October. Caleb Prentice said he'd take you through Roundup if you wanted. I was going to mention it. I want it, Silas said. No hesitation. Bram nodded. They sat for a minute in the dark. An owl called somewhere east of the fence, and neither of them said anything about it. You know what my father was good at? Silas said. Not angry, not grieving exactly, more like a person taking stock. He was good at starting things. He was real good at the part where he explained how it was going to work out. He picked at a splinter on the porch step. He wasn't good at the part after that. Bram thought about how to respond and settled on honest. Some people are like that. Yeah, Silas looked at the dark. I keep thinking about what's different, about why some things work out and some things don't. He paused. I think it's whether you're still there on the bad days. Bram was quiet for a moment. That's most of it, he said. Silas nodded. He seemed satisfied with that, not because it was a grand answer, but because it was a true one, and Silas had enough experience with untrue ones to know the difference. He got up after a while and went inside, and Bram heard the creak of the storage building door. The new wall, Ephraim's work, had changed the sound of it slightly, more solid, less complaint. Bram sat until the stars shifted noticeably westward, which took a while, and then went inside. The next 2 weeks ran like a machine with some bad gears mostly functional, with specific moments of grinding. Pierce filed the response and the counterfiling on the property claim. A letter came back from the Kansas Concern's legal representative that was aggressive in tone and thin on actual documentation, which Pierce said was a good sign. Silas started roundup work with the Prentice operation and came home at the end of each day, tired in a way that looked different from childhood tired. It was the tiredness of real work, of a body being used at its actual capacity. And he wore it without complaint, and sometimes with a quiet satisfaction that showed in the way he sat down at dinner and ate like a man who'd earned it. The Dale Preserves order went out 17 jars, more than the Dales had asked for but priced accordingly, and Clara Dale sent word back that she wanted the same again in November. A woman named Hester Vance rode out from the West Settlement specifically to commission a winter coat from Elowen, which was a more complex order than a dress and would take 3 weeks and paid accordingly. Elowen took the order and asked for the fabric by the following Tuesday, and Hester said yes without negotiating the price, which meant Elowen had set it right. The operating fund started coming back, slowly, not dramatically, but consistently, which was the quality that actually mattered. And then, on a Thursday morning in the first week of October, Orson Ketteridge came back for the 3rd time. He came alone again. Came to the gate, waited. Bram went to meet him. They stood on opposite sides of the gate, same as last time, and Bram looked at Orson and noticed something different about him that he couldn't immediately place. Then he placed it. Orson looked tired. Not physically, the man was solid as he'd ever been, but behind the eyes, in the way a person looks when something that has been easy for a long time has recently required actual effort. "I know you talked to the Fairburn boy," Orson said. "I did," Bram said, "and I know about the Pierce filing on the property claim. Word gets around." Orson looked at the yard behind Bram, at the improved storage building with its new wall and the repaired south face, at the late-season garden that had been picked over but was still standing in good order, at the chicken coop that Maisie had reorganized, at Nell coming out of the house with a basket, heading toward the cellar, at Finn sitting in the dust near the pump with his rocks. Orson looked at all of it for a long moment. "My offer," he started. "Orson," Bram said it quietly but clearly, "I'm not selling." Orson looked at him. Not angry, something more complicated than angry. "You know I could have made this harder for you," he said. "I know you did make it harder for me. The water claim was yours?" "Yeah," Bram held his eyes. "I know." Orson was quiet. He looked at the yard again, and this time the look on his face wasn't calculation. Bram watched it happen, watched the man look at a yard full of children and work and order and the specific evidence of a functioning household, and feel something about it that he hadn't expected to feel. "I built Black Spur alone," Orson said. He didn't say it with pride. He said it like he was reading something off a list. 30 years. Everything I have, I built alone." Bram waited. "My wife left in 74, Orson said. "Couldn't take the isolation. I didn't understand it then." He stopped, pressed his lips together. Then quietly, "I understand it now." Something shifted in Bram that wasn't sympathy exactly, or wasn't only that. "You want to come in," Bram said. "Have coffee." Orson looked at him for a moment with an expression that moved through surprise and something like relief and settled somewhere Bram couldn't name. "No," he said. "Not today." He picked up his reins. "But I won't be back with an offer. Not anymore." He turned his horse. "Orson," Bram said. Orson looked back. "The Fairburn upstream claim," Bram said. "Wesley Fairburn told me he'd consider selling it. If you wanted to approach him directly as a fair deal, not what your man tried to do, it might be worth your time. That claim is worth having, and he doesn't know the land." Orson stared at him. "Why would you tell me that?" Bram thought about it. "Because you having a legitimate water management claim upstream is better for the territory than you having an illegitimate one," he said. "And because I'd rather have a neighbor I can deal with than one I'm always fighting." A long pause. "That's a hell of a thing to say to a man who tried to take your water rights," Orson said. "Yeah," Bram agreed. "It is." Orson held his gaze for another moment. Then he rode away, and this time the pace of it was different, not the slow, deliberate "I own this already" pace of his first visits, but something quieter and without performance, just a man going home at the end of a long day. Bram stood at the gate and watched him go, and thought about what it cost a person to build everything alone, not just the work, but the cost to what you became after 30 years of it. He thought about his own house before July, before the ravine and the shattered wagon, and 6 people who arrived with nothing and built something anyway. He thought it was a steep price. Tobin appeared at his elbow. "Was that the mean man?" Tobin asked. "That's Mr. Ketteridge," Bram said. "Is he still mean?" Bram considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "I think he might be lonely," he said. Tobin thought about this. "That's almost as bad," he said, and went back to his stick structure, which had by this point evolved into something ambitious enough that Finn had been recruited as an assistant architect. Bram watched them for a moment. Then he turned back toward the house where Elowen was working, and the cellar was full of 41 jars, and the operating fund was growing back, and the partnership paper sat on the shelf above the fireplace, held in place by a piece of red shale, and walked toward all of it. October moved through Cinder Creek the way it always did in Colorado territory, not gently, not with any particular concern for whether you were ready. The mornings went from cool to cold between one week and the next, and the light changed in that specific autumn way that made everything look sharper and closer and slightly more urgent. Like the land itself was saying, "Pay attention. This is the last of the good weather. Use it." Bram used it. There was a particular quality to work in October that he'd always appreciated, the clarity of it, The way the list of things to do before first snow was concrete and finite in a way that summer's endless maintenance never quite was. You could see the end of it, winterize the water trough heating. Check the roof on the main house. Get the hay situation sorted before the prices went up in November. Stack wood. A lot of wood. He and Silas worked the woodpile for 3 days straight, splitting and stacking with a rhythm that didn't require conversation and so didn't get much. By the end of the third day, they had a stack against the south wall of the main house that Bram estimated at 2 months' worth of heating, which was not enough. They needed 4 months' worth, minimum. 3 more days, Silas said, looking at the stack. At least, Bram said. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers. He was taller than he'd been in July, not dramatically, but noticeably, the kind of growth that happens when a boy who's been underfed starts eating properly and his body catches up with its own plans. He had calluses on his palms now that hadn't been there when he arrived. He looked at the woodpile with the assessing eye of someone who was starting to think in terms of operational requirements rather than just tasks. If we start at first light Saturday, Silas said, and Tobin can help stack. Tobin will want to help split. Tobin is 8'6", I mean. Silas caught himself. The boy's birthday had passed in September, quietly, with a cake that Maisie had been the primary architect of, involving cornmeal and dried apple and an ambitious amount of cinnamon. He can stack. He'll argue about it. I'll handle Tobin. Bram looked at him. Silas said it with the older brother certainty of someone who had been managing his siblings his entire life and knew exactly which approach worked with which one. All right, Bram said Saturday. They worked until dark and went in and ate the dinner. Elowen had left warming she'd been in Greybend that day for a fitting with Hester Vance and the coat commission that was now in its second week and apparently requiring more structural decisions than either of them had anticipated. She came back in the early evening with a piece of scrap fabric pinned to her sleeve and the look of a woman who'd been solving problems all day and was doing the mental math on how many hours of sewing she had left versus how many she had available. She sat down at the table, and Nell put food in front of her, and she ate half of it while looking at the scrap fabric. The lining's the issue, she said, to no one in particular. The coat, Nell said. The lining has to be tacked at the hem or it'll pull. But tacking it means she stopped. Just a small, frustrated sound. I'll figure it out. You want me to look at it? Nell said. Elowen looked at her daughter. You know lining tack. I watched you do it on the second Dale dress, Nell said. I think I know what you're trying to avoid. Elowen slid the scrap fabric across the table. Nell looked at it for a moment, turned it over, and said something about the grain direction that made Elowen straighten up slightly and pay different attention. They talked about it in the specific shorthand of two people who've been working alongside each other, long enough have developed a shared technical language. And Bram ate his dinner and listened to it the way you listen to something you don't entirely understand but recognize as good. After dinner, Finn climbed onto Bram's lap with the directness of a 4-year-old who has decided where he wants to be and sees no reason to negotiate about it. He had a rock. New acquisition, a piece of pale green stone with a quartz vein through it that he'd found near the creek bed that afternoon. This one's yours, Finn said, and put it in Bram's shirt pocket. Bram looked down at him. I've got a fair number of yours already. This one's different, Finn said, with great seriousness. It's got a stripe. It does, Bram agreed. Finn settled in, apparently satisfied with this transaction, and fell asleep in approximately 6 minutes, which was his usual speed. Bram sat with the weight of the child against his chest and looked at the room, Elowen and Nell at the table with the fabric, Maisie drawing on the back of a flour sack again, Tobin asleep already, Silas on the porch doing something with rope that he'd been learning from the prentice hands and felt that the same thing he'd felt at intervals since July, the thing that didn't have a clean name. Not happiness exactly. More than that, and more complicated and more real. The legal situation resolved in the second week of October. Pierce sent a letter that was 3 pages long and said in summary that the Kansas Concerns documentation had turned out to be significantly weaker than their initial aggressive tone had suggested, that 2 of the debt instruments had Thomas Harrow's name alone with no co-signatory, and that the third was for a debt incurred after Elowen had demonstrably left Kansas, which made her liability under territorial law essentially non-existent. The concern had been given a formal response and had withdrawn the property claim inquiry. Elowen read the letter at the kitchen table, alone early in the morning before anyone else was up. Bram came in for coffee and found her sitting with it. Not crying, Elowen wasn't a crier, not in front of people, but with her face doing something that was the closest to undone he'd seen it. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and sat down. "It's done," he said. "It's done." She set the letter on the table. Picked up the coffee. "The property is clear. The partnership is solid." She stared at the cup. 3 months ago I was in a ravine. Bram said nothing. "I had $6 and a broken wagon and 5 children, and a husband who was already gone even before he left." She said it flatly, not for sympathy, just placing the facts. "And now I have a legal partnership in a functioning ranch and a sewing income," and she stopped. "And?" he said. She looked at him. There was something in her eyes that she didn't dress up or just let him see. "And people I trust," she said. "That's not a small thing." "For me, that's not a small thing at all." Bram held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "No, it isn't." They drank their coffee in the early morning quiet, and the fire put out its steady warmth, and outside the sky was doing the October thing of being enormous and clear and cold, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. The decision about the cabin came to Bram the way significant decisions sometimes do not as a thunderbolt, but as something he realized he'd already made without formally acknowledging it. It had been building since the legal situation resolved, maybe before that. Maybe since the night Orson Ketteridge stood at the gate and looked at Finn in the dirt, with his rocks and whatever had happened in the man's face. He went to find Ephraim Tolliver on a Wednesday, driving out to the East Valley in the ranch wagon. Ephraim was at his own woodpile, which was considerably larger than Bram's, and organized with the precision of a man who had thought carefully about which lengths went where. "I want to build a cabin," Bram said. Ephraim turned around. He looked at Bram with the patient assessment of someone who understands that a sentence like that has more behind it than the words. "For the family," he said. "Proper cabin. 2 rooms, good chimney, real windows, floor that's actually level." Bram looked at him steadily. "Not a storage building with improvements, a house." Ephraim set down his splitting maul. "You've got enough timber credit from the mill?" "Not yet. But if you'll help me plan it, I can have the material situation sorted in 2 weeks. Curtis is finishing up the holler barn through mid-month." Ephraim thought about it. "3rd week of October we could start framing, if the ground's not frozen hard yet." "It won't be. Not for another 3 weeks, the way this season's running." Ephraim picked his maul back up. "Come back Saturday with your site measurements. We'll talk materials." Bram drove back to Cinder Creek with the particular feeling of someone who has put a large thing in motion and can't unput it in motion, which is its own combination of terrifying and right. He told Elowen that night, not as a proposal, exactly, not asking permission, because he'd passed through that particular gate when they signed the partnership paper, but as what it was, which was one partner telling the other about a significant decision that affected them both. She looked at him for a long moment after he finished. "That's a large expense," she said. "Yes. We just rebuilt the operating fund." "Yes. And you want to spend most of it on—" "Not most of it," he said. "Ephraim's on credit from the mill, same as last time. I'd put in labor and what cash I have and call in what I can from the neighbors. It won't empty us, Bram." She said it with the patience she used when she needed him to understand she was taking something seriously. "Why?" He thought about how to say it. There were several versions of the answer, and he tried to find the one that was most honest. "Because you and your children cannot spend a Colorado winter in a storage building," he said. "Even with the new wall, that structure is not built for deep cold. I know that building. I know what it does in January." He paused. "And because if this is going to be what the partnership paper says, it is a real partnership, not a temporary arrangement, then you need a real home on this land. Not a borrowed corner of mine." She was quiet. "The children need that," he said. "Finn needs to stop thinking of himself as a guest. Tobin needs—" He stopped. "They need to know it's theirs, that it doesn't go away." Elowen looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked up. "Where would you build it?" she asked. He'd thought about this. The flat area south of the main house, between the house and the new garden extension. Close enough to share the well access, far enough to be its own space. How far from the creek? 50 yards, maybe. High enough ground that spring runoff won't be a problem. She nodded slowly. 2 rooms, and a proper loft for the older 3. Real stairs, not a ladder. He paused. Maisie told Tobin she wanted a window. I heard her say it. He said it simply, without making anything of it, just the fact. Elowen looked at him. Maisie tells Tobin a lot of things, she said quietly. I know. He held her gaze. She should have a window. Elowen pressed her hands flat on the table. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire settled and cracked, and somewhere outside a coyote made its cold weather sound, high and thin. All right, she said. Saturday came, and Bram went back to Ephraim with site measurements on paper, and they spent 2 hours at Ephraim's kitchen table with a site sketch and Ephraim's 40 years of building knowledge going through the materials list piece by piece. Ephraim had opinions about foundation stones that he expressed at length, and Bram mostly agreed with, because Ephraim's opinions about building were well-founded. Ephraim's wife Ada brought coffee without being asked and sat at the other end of the table sewing, not participating in the conversation, but present in the way of a woman who's been part of a working household for 30 years and understands that being present is itself a contribution. By the end of it, they had a materials list and a rough schedule. Ephraim said he'd talk to Curtis about the 3rd week of October. Bram said he'd reach out to the Prentice brothers. Caleb won't come, Ephraim said. No, Bram agreed. But his brother will. And the Dale boy? Young Merton's son, the one who's been doing carpentry work for the settlement. I'll ask. Ephraim looked at Bram across the table, with the expression of a man who wants to say something and is deciding whether to say it. Then he said it. Your father would have done this, he said. The building. For people who needed it. Bram looked at his site sketch. I know, he said. You're more like him than you think you are. Ephraim picked up his coffee. That's not nothing, what I just said. I know it isn't, Bram said. Thank you. He drove back and told Silas about the plan on the way to the woodpile the next morning, because Silas had become the person he told things to first when they involved the ranch's operation, not instead of Elowen, but alongside, as someone who had a stake in understanding how things worked and why decisions got made. Silas listened without interrupting. Then, when do we start framing? 3rd week of October, weather willing. I can help with that, Silas said. I watched Ephraim's man Curtis do the storage building repair. I know which end I'm useful at. You're useful at most ends, Bram said. He meant it. Silas didn't say anything to that, but something in the way he picked up his splitting maul showed that he'd heard it, and it mattered. The news spread through the small community, the way news always spread there, not through any deliberate announcement, but through the specific geography of people who share roads and water sources, and sometimes fences. Where information moves, because people talk and talking, is one of the ways humans confirm they exist to each other. By the time Bram had formally spoken to the Prentice brother, and to young Dale, it turned out that Merton Dale himself had already heard, and had already decided he was coming regardless. And that Marjorie Dale had told 3 women who had collectively told 6 more. It became, as these things have a way of doing, in places where people know each other's troubles, a community project. This was not something Bram had planned for, or, frankly, entirely expected. He'd thought it would be him and Ephraim and Curtis, and whoever else he could directly recruit. What it turned into was 15 people showing up on the 3rd Saturday of October, with tools and intent, and enough combined knowledge of construction to keep each other honest. Silas, who had become the kind of young man who woke up before the work started, had the site cleared and the foundation stones laid out before the first wagon arrived. He'd done it based on the sketch Bram had shown him and his own careful measurement, and when Ephraim Tolliver walked the layout with his experienced eyes and made 2 small adjustments, Silas noted exactly what those adjustments were and why. And the look on his face was the look of someone learning something in the way that actually sticks. The framing went up over 3 days. It was imperfect. The way real buildings are, there were disagreements about the best way to set the loft joists that took an hour to resolve, and ended with a compromise that was probably the right answer anyway. And the east window had to be repositioned twice, because the first placement created a structural awkwardness that Ephraim caught before it became permanent. Young Dale's carpentry skills were better than Bram had expected, but his speed was slower, which balanced out in the end because what he did was solid. Elowen came out each day and looked at the progress with a careful private expression that she didn't explain and nobody asked her to. She brought food for the workers, enormous amounts of it, drawing on the cellar stores in a way that was genuinely generous. And people ate it and worked and said things to each other about the work that were the particular form of male sociability. That happens when a group of men are doing something concrete and useful together. Maisie appeared on the second day and stood at the east wall where her window was going to be and looked at the framed opening with an expression of absolute satisfaction, the way you look at a promise that's being kept. Finn, strictly prohibited from the construction area by Elowen, and Bram simultaneously, watched from a safe distance with Tobin, both of them providing a running commentary to each other that involved a significant amount of inaccurate technical terminology that Tobin had picked up from listening to Bram and Silas and was using with great confidence. By the end of the third day, the shell was up. It wasn't done, it needed chinking, and the roof needed completion, and the interior work was still ahead, but it was standing, and it was clearly a house. And when the last wagon rolled out as the sun went down, and Bram stood in the cleared yard and looked at it, he felt something that he associated with his father's time. A particular quality of satisfaction that came not from what you'd done for yourself, but from what you'd done that had weight beyond yourself. He heard footsteps behind him. Elowen came and stood beside him, and they looked at the cabin frame together in the last light. "There's a lot still to do," she said. "Couple more weeks. Will it be ready before the hard cold? It'll be habitable. The finishing work can happen inside once the walls are tight." He looked at the window frames. The east windows placed well. Gets morning light. She was quiet for a moment. Maisie told Finn that the light in the mornings would wake them up, she said. "She's already decided who sleeps where in the loft." "She has opinions," Bram said. "She's always had opinions." Elowen's voice had something warm in it. "She gets that honestly." She paused. "Where does she get it from, do you think?" Bram looked at her sideways. "Right," she said, and almost smiled. The interior work took 11 days. Curtis came back for 4 of them and did the loft stairs himself, which was fortunate because the loft stairs turned out to be more complicated than anticipated. The pitch of the ceiling and the available floor space required a solution that Curtis arrived at through a process of trial and measurement and a certain amount of productive frustration that Silas observed closely and learned from. The stairs ended up exactly right, solid, not too steep, with a railing that was simple and functional. Nelt inspected them immediately when they were done, going up and coming back down twice, and announced that the second step had a very slight give that should probably be looked at. Curtis looked at it and fixed it without comment. Nell had a way of being right about structural details that Curtis found more interesting than annoying, which was a good quality in a 10-year-old in a construction context. The chinking was everyone's job, in the sense that Bram mixed it, and Elowen applied it on the lower courses, and Silas on the middle, and Tobin, under supervision, did the lowest 6 inches of the north wall with great seriousness. It was cold, messy work, and it smelled bad, and Tobin complained about the smell for approximately 20 minutes before deciding that doing the work was better than not doing it, which was a decision that Bram noted without commenting on. The fireplace was Ephraim's work, and Ephraim treated it as the centerpiece it was. He spent the better part of 2 days on the chimney draw and the hearth placement, making adjustments that nobody else could entirely see the reason for, but that Ephraim said would matter in February when a bad draw could fill the cabin with smoke. They took his word for it. The last thing was the floor. Bram and Silas laid it over 2 days, fitted boards from the mill that Bram had paid for, with the last of what he'd set aside specifically for this purpose. And the fitting required patience because the room was not quite square. Real buildings and real terrain never were, and getting the boards tight against the walls meant trimming and testing and trimming again. Silas did most of the trimming because he'd developed an instinct for it, a feel for how much to take off that Bram had noticed developing over weeks and now trusted. When the last board was down and the 2 of them were standing in the empty room looking at it, Silas said, "It's level." "Just about," Bram said. There was a very slight dip toward the southeast corner that you'd only notice if you were looking for it. He'd decided it didn't matter. Better than level would have been in that storage building, Silas said. "A lot of things are better than that storage building." Silas looked around the room at the east window with its morning light, at the fireplace with Ephraim's careful brickwork, at the loft opening with Curtis's solid stairs going up. "I'm going to learn to build things properly," he said. It wasn't a random statement. It had the quality of something he'd been working towards saying. "You already know some of it," Bram said. "I mean really properly. I want to understand the whole thing. Framing, joinery, all of it." He looked at Bram. "You think Ephraim would teach me?" Bram thought about it. "I think if you asked him directly, he would." He paused. "Ephraim respects people who ask direct questions about things they actually want to learn. He's got less patience for people who want to appear like they know things." Silas nodded. "I'll ask him." He looked at the floor. "This is good work," he said. And he said it the way you say something when you mean the work of the past months, not just the floor. "Yeah," Bram said. "It is." They moved the family in on the 1st of November. It was not a grand event. There was nothing particularly ceremonial about it. They carried bedrolls and clothing, and the small accumulation of things that the children had gathered over 4 months: Finn's rocks, Maisie's drawings, Nell's record books, Tobin's stick constructions that he'd been reluctant to leave behind and was allowed to bring, because the argument about leaving them wasn't worth the time. Elowen carried the sewing basket and the fabric for Hester Vance's coat, which was nearly done. Bram carried Finn, because Finn had decided he wanted to be carried across the threshold specifically, for reasons of his own that he didn't explain and nobody asked him to. They lit the fire in the new fireplace, and it drew cleanly, which was Ephraim's work, doing what it was supposed to do, and the room filled with warmth that was different from the warmth of the main house, not better or worse, just belonging to a different space, a space that was theirs. Maisie went up the loft stairs first. She stood at the top and looked at the east window from above, from where she'd be sleeping, and the last afternoon light was coming through it in the way she'd apparently already imagined it would. And she said, "Yes," to herself, quietly, the way you say something when reality has matched what you hoped for. Tobin went up second and immediately began arranging his sticks in the corner furthest from the stairs, which he designated his area with the same property claim instinct that all 6-year-olds apparently share. Finn, once set down, went to the window at ground level and stood on his toes to see out of it, and found it looked toward the main house and the pump, and seemed satisfied by this. Silas walked the perimeter of both rooms the way Bram had seen him walk a fence line, checking it, assessing it, understanding it as a structure he was now responsible for helping to maintain. Nell stood in the center of the main room and looked at the fireplace and at the window and at the stairs and then at Bram. "Thank you," she said. She said it with the directness of someone who means it exactly as stated and doesn't need to add anything to it. Bram said, "You're welcome," and meant that exactly as stated too. He went back to the main house that evening and sat at his table and ate alone for the first time in months, which should have felt like a restoration of something of privacy, of his own space, and mostly did. Mostly. The operating fund had taken a hit from the cabin build, as Elowen had anticipated and he'd acknowledged. They'd managed it better than he'd feared. The community help had reduced the cash expense significantly, and the mill credit was structured over 6 months at reasonable terms, but the numbers were tighter than they'd been in September. He got out his envelope and did the accounting the way his father had taught him. On the income side, Elowen's sewing orders through November, which she'd already taken deposits on. The egg income, steady. The Dale Preserves order for November. Silas's wage work, which would slow in winter, but wouldn't stop completely. He'd arranged 4 days of winter maintenance work, with the Prentice operation through December. The possible sale of 2 breeding heifers from the small herd that Bram thought were surplus to his winter capacity. On the expense side, the mill credit payment, due in December. The lawyer's final fee, which had been billed and he'd paid but had set his cash reserves back. Winter feed for the stock, which he'd ordered at pre-winter prices and was sitting in the barn but represented money already spent. The number at the bottom of the envelope was not comfortable, but it was a number that, with careful management through winter, could work. He was staring at this number when he heard a knock at his door. Not Elowen, she wouldn't knock. Not one of the children they knocked differently, when they knocked at all. He opened the door. Orson Ketteridge stood on the porch. In the dark, without his ranch owner posture, Without the gray horse at his back, he looked like what he was, a man in his 60s who had ridden somewhere in the cold because he had something he needed to say and had decided to say it. Bram opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. Orson came in. He held his hat in his hands, which was different from every previous version of Orson Ketteridge that Bram had dealt with. He looked at the room, the envelope accounting on the table, the coffee pot on the fire, the 2 chairs, and he sat in the chair that Bram directed him to, and Bram poured him coffee and sat down across from him. They looked at each other. "I went and talked to Wesley Fairburn," Orson said. "I heard," Bram said. He'd heard from Merton Dale, who heard from someone at the hotel. "Fair deal?" "Fair deal." He knew enough to ask the right questions this time. Orson held the coffee cup. "I should have gone to him that way first. He stopped. Instead of having Dillard file a counterclaim," Bram said. Yes, Bram waited. Orson set the cup down. He looked at the table, and then at Bram with the expression of a man who has been doing a particular kind of accounting, not the envelope kind, the internal kind, and has arrived at a number he doesn't entirely like. "I came here 3 times to try to buy you out," Orson said. "I know, I was here. I knew you were struggling. I knew your water situation. I knew about the drought. I knew you didn't have people." He said each thing separately, deliberately. "I used all of it. The water claim, I'd had Dillard watching the Fairburn situation for 2 years waiting for an opportunity." Bram was quiet. "I want to tell you I'm sorry for that," Orson said. He said it plainly, without extra words around it, which was the right way to say it. Not because your situation improved anyway, because it was the wrong way to do business with a neighbor. He looked up. "Your father never did business with me that way." Bram looked at his coffee cup. "No," he said. "He wouldn't have. I built Black Spur by being harder than the land and the weather and anybody who got in the way." Orson's voice had something tired in it. "That works for a long time. And then one day you look at what you built and you realize the thing that's missing isn't something you can acquire or file paperwork for." He looked toward the window, in the direction of the new cabin where, visible through the glass, the light in Elowen's window was on. "I watched you carry that boy 1/2 mile, Orson said. Bram looked up. "I was on the Ridge Road," Orson said. "Coming back from the Dale property. I saw you come out of the scrub with the boy on your back, and I watched you walk all the way to your gate." He held Bram's gaze. "I almost rode down. He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business." A pause. "I've thought about that a fair amount since." The fire settled. Outside, the wind moved through the gap between the main house and the new cabin with a sound like something breathing. "Why didn't you?" Bram said. "Because I'd already told myself a story about this place," Orson said. "About you failing, about the land coming available. And when I saw you on that road, I knew the story was wrong and I wasn't ready to let go of it yet." He exhaled. "That's not a thing I'm proud of." Bram sat with this. "It was a strange thing, sitting in your own kitchen with the man who'd spent 3 months trying to take your ranch, listening to him be honest about it. Strange and unexpectedly, not uncomplicated, because Orson Ketteridge was not purely a villain that would have been easier, and life was very rarely that clean. He was a man who had built himself into a certain shape over 30 years and was sitting in someone else's kitchen, realized the shape had costs he hadn't fully tallied. You still own the biggest operation in this territory," Bram said. "I do. You've got more than you need." "I have." Orson looked at the table. "But I eat dinner alone. Every night." He said it with the flatness of a man delivering a verdict. "I have done for a long time, and it didn't feel like a problem until I started paying attention to this place." He picked up his coffee and finished it. "I'm not going to make you a speech about it," Orson said. "I came to apologize. I've done that. And to tell you that if you need anything this winter cattle emergency, weather trouble, anything that a neighbor with resources ought to help with you should ask." He set the cup down. "I mean that." Bram looked at him for a moment. "All right," he said. Orson stood. He put his hat on. He looked at Bram, with the expression of a man who has done something difficult and is glad to have done it, but is not going to extend the moment longer than it needs to be. "The cabin's good work," he said. "Tolliver built that?" "Tolliver and Curtis and about 12 other people," Bram said. Orson nodded. He moved toward the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back. The woman, he said. Harrow. Bram waited. She's the reason this place turned, Orson said. I want you to know that I can see that. It wasn't just you. He held Bram's gaze for a moment. She's a real partner. I know she is, Bram said. That's why I made it legal. Orson looked at him for one more moment. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that closes something, and walked out into the cold. Bram sat alone at his table for a while after that. He thought about what Orson had said, I eat dinner alone, every night, and thought about the months before July, before the ravine and the 6 strangers, when he'd done the same. Every night, beans and silence, and the particular sound of a house with only one person in it. He got up and went to the window. The light was still on in Elowen's cabin. Through the glass, he could see the faint movement of someone up late her, probably, with the Vance coat in her lap, working the lining problem she'd finally solved 2 days ago. The older children's shadows moved briefly in the loft window. Finn's light was already out. Bram looked at his ranch. Not a lonely man's diminishing hold on failing land anymore. 2 houses now, connected by 40 feet of cleared ground, and a shared well and a legal document and 4 months of work that had changed what the word home meant to some people. He went back to his envelope on the table and added one more line at the bottom, below the winter expenses and the income projections. He wrote, spring orchard trees, east of cabin, 6-8 trees. Then he folded the envelope and put out the lamp and went to bed. Outside, the first real cold of the season moved in from the north, and the new cabin's chimney put up a straight line of smoke against the dark sky, and the ranch that had been one man's losing battle became, in the night and the cold and the steady, ordinary way of things that are finally working, something that intended to last. The first snow came on a Thursday. Not a blizzard, Colorado saved those for January, but a real snow, several inches of it, the kind that covered the ground completely and changed the sound of everything, muffled the world down to something quieter and more interior. Bram stood at his window in the early morning and watched it fall and thought about the envelope on the table with spring orchard trees written at the bottom, and felt for the first time in years that spring was something he was genuinely planning for rather than just hoping to survive to. The community gathering happened 2 weeks into December, the way these things did in the territory not organized formally, more assembled by collective agreement. People deciding they wanted to come together before the deep cold made travel difficult. It was held at Cinder Creek because Merton Dale suggested it and nobody argued, and because by that point Cinder Creek had become the kind of place people wanted to come to, which was a thing Bram would not have predicted in July. 15 people came. Then 20. By mid-afternoon there were 26, which was more than the main house could hold, so they spread between both buildings with the cabin door open and a fire going in both fireplaces. Ephraim Tolliver stood in the cabin doorway for a while, looking at the fireplace draw with professional satisfaction. The Prentice brothers ate everything Elowen put in front of them. Marjorie Dale sat with Elowen at the sewing table and looked at the Vance coat, which had been delivered and paid for the week before, and made sounds of genuine appreciation. Maisie organized the children, the visiting ones, not just her own siblings, into something that was either a game or a production of some kind. It was hard to tell. But it involved the east window and a great deal of serious instruction from Maisie and compliance from the others, which said something about Maisie at 8 years old. Tobin attached himself to young son Dale and taught him about the stick construction system with the authority of a 6-year-old who has refined his craft over months. Silas talked cattle with Caleb Prentice for 40 minutes in the barn, which was the kind of conversation Silas had been preparing for without knowing it. Since the first day he'd walked a fence line beside Bram and started asking questions about how the larger operation worked. Caleb told Bram later, quietly, that the boy had a real head for it and he'd take him on regular through the next season if the arrangement suited. Finn fell asleep on Ephraim Tolliver's coat, which Ephraim had laid over the chair by the fire and then not had the heart to reclaim. By evening, when the gathering wound down and the wagons loaded, and people made their way back into the cold with the specific warmth of people who have eaten well and talked and felt themselves part of something that's working, Bram stood at the gate and watched them go and thought about the version of this place that had existed 6 months ago. 1 man, dying garden, 4 hens, a well dropping by the week. He thought the math never added up then, And I kept doing it anyway, because what else do you do? Elowen came and stood beside him at the gate. The last wagon disappeared around the tree line. The cold was clean and direct. Snow on the ground, smoke from 2 chimneys, the sound of Nell getting the younger one settled inside. "Good day," Elowen said. "Yeah," Bram said. They stood there for a moment in the dark and the cold. "I need to tell you something," Elowen said. He looked at her. "When you found us in that ravine," she said. "When you came under the canvas with your hands up." She paused. "I thought you were the last bad thing in a long line of bad things. I was ready to fight you with a piece of broken wagon board." "I remember the board," Bram said. "I thought my children's future had ended in that ravine." She said it quietly, without drama, just placing the fact. I'd been holding that thought for 4 days, and it had become the only thought I had room for. He was quiet. "I need you to know," she said, "that I don't think that anymore. About the future. About what's possible." She looked at him steadily. "You did that, not just by finding us, by staying with it when it would have been easier not to." Bram looked at the 2 chimneys putting up their smoke against the dark sky. "I need to tell you something too," he said. She waited. "Before July," he said. "Before the ravine. I was doing the same thing you were." He turned to look at her. "Not in a ditch. But I was down to my last real season, and I knew it, and the thought I kept having, the only one I had room for, was that I'd run out of time to make anything of this place." He paused. "That I'd end up like Orson. More land than you need, and nothing alive in it." Elowen held his gaze. "You asked me once why I stopped," he said. "I told you about my conscience. That was true. But the other true thing is that I was so tired of doing it alone that when I heard that child's voice in the ravine, some part of me just stopped making excuses." She was quiet for a moment. "Then we saved each other," she said. "Not a question." "Something like that," he said. "Yeah." They stood at the gate in the cold for another minute, not saying anything else, because some things don't need more words once they've been said right. Then Elowen said the orchard. He looked at her. "I saw the envelope," she said. 6 to 8 trees. East of the cabin. He hadn't hidden it, hadn't meant to keep it from her. "In the spring," he said. "If the ground thaws when I think it will." "Apple and cherry," she said. "The cherry takes longer, but it's hardier. And the children like cherries. I know they do. We should plant both." She looked at the east edge of the property. Dark now, snow-covered, invisible in the night, but there. "They won't bear fruit for years." "I know," Bram said. "That's why it matters," she said, "that we're planting them." He understood what she meant. You plant an orchard when you believe in the future enough to do work that benefits a version of yourself that doesn't exist yet. You plant it when you've stopped thinking in terms of surviving to spring and started thinking in terms of what the land looks like in 10 years, in 20. When Finn is grown, and the trees are full, and the ranch has become what you always intended it to be. He had spent a long time not believing that version of himself would arrive. Now he was planting trees for it. Inside the cabin, Maisie's voice rose briefly in something that was either an argument or a song, and then Nell's voice, calm and organizing, and then quiet. Tobin said something to Finn that made Finn laugh, the particular laugh of a 4-year-old who's been caught off guard by something genuinely funny. Silas's boots on the cabin floor, deliberate and even. Bram listened to all of it. He thought about what it had cost him to stop at that ravine. The medicine money, the lawyer's fees, the cabin build, the operating fund scraped down twice and rebuilt twice. The 2 days he'd lost to his own body failing him. The fence wire he still hadn't bought. He thought about what it had given him. And there was no clean accounting for it, no envelope math that captured it, because the things on the second list were not the kind that fit in numbers. They were the kind that showed up in the sound of Finn's laugh through a cabin wall, in Silas asking Ephraim Tolliver to teach him joinery, in Nell's careful hand on the household records, in Elowen standing beside him at a gate that now belonged to both of them. The things you gain when you stop trying to hold a life together alone. "Come inside," Elowen said. "It's cold." "In a minute," he said. She went in. He stood at the gate 1 more minute, long enough to feel the cold properly, and let it be real. Let all of it be real. The 2 houses, the full cellar, the legal partnership, the apology from a neighbor who'd run out of reasons to be an enemy. The orchard they were going to plant in the spring. Then he turned and walked toward the light.